All right, thank you, Aaron. It's nice to see a lot of friendly faces here. For those who might not know me, I work with the audit team. I've been working with them about 6 years, and I also do resolutions of AQDAs. So I'll be talking about CANs and AQDAs. Hopefully, trying to convince you it's a friend, not a foe. Kind of like the friend who tells you got parsley in your teeth, kind of friend. You know, a good friend will tell you that. So what are these corrective action mechanisms? We've got corrective action notifications, CANs, and these within our PQAO, anybody who's adopted this process, operators, personnel, anybody can issue a CAN. The AQDAs are still issued exclusively by auditors when critical criteria are not met. And auditors can also issue CANs, and I'll kind of try to specify the distinction, how you choose as maybe a station operator to issue a CAN, whereas when we might be issuing a CAN. So CANs will be discussed in more detail by Amon Baines in a breakout session, but in short, they're not used to discredit anybody. The idea is to document an issue that may be affecting data quality. It's something that you can issue one, but the idea is for example, if you've got an instrument that is starting to drift and you have a mechanism to deal with that, like you have your calibrator come out and recalibrate it, then that might not require a CAN. But if it's a repetitive issue, and it might be specific to that instrument or maybe to a standard used, it might be worthwhile to issue a CAN because the quality management branch, they see a lot of these CANs coming in, and if there's a common issue, then they can let everybody else know through a memo. We've got something that everybody should be aware of. So it's a way of documenting something that can affect, that everybody maybe should know about. So for the audit team, when we decide, it's a little different. It doesn't have to be necessarily a repeating issue, since we're there taking a snapshot, kind of a day in the life of the station kind of audit. We'll issue a CAN on certain non-critical criteria. Like we've decided citing is a good one to issue a CAN. Back in the day, before the CAN process existed, we used to have to issue AQDAs on when a tree was starting to get a little too tall. But now we have the CAN that we can issue. We still issue AQDAs for when you fail a gaseous audit or a flow audit. But we have this choice of two corrective action mechanisms that we can employ. So now I'm going to focus on AQDAs. Like I said, Amon Baines, and I highly recommend his breakout session about CANs if you want to get a little more into the CAN process. For AQDAs, if a sampler is operating outside the control limits, an AQDA is issued, and then you have some time to respond to it. You have about 45 days where that's the period in which we'd like to see a response, a proposed response. And then we go through, this is more the friend rather than the foe, kind of a collaborative process of trying to, see if sometimes that proposed resolution, I'm fine with it, and we go through and do the action that's proposed. Sometimes I need more documentation. Sometimes the proposed action is what seems like too long of a data invalidation. Maybe we try to tease out some documentation that might help shorten an invalidation period if that's the chosen action. So that's where the discussion begins. That's where we correspond back and forth. And then once we have decided, okay, this is what we're doing. We're either releasing the data, or we're flagging it with a qualifier, or we're having it invalidate. Any of those three things. Once we decide on that action, then we have to verify through the AMP 350 report that that action was done. Once I can see that that's been done in AQS, then we send out a closure letter, and then that AQDA is formally closed. So I want to take a little bit of time to go through three scenarios, kind of to show how we've resolved or how certain AQDAs are resolved. A very common one is the missed flow check. And this one is one that hopefully, if you've received AQDAs for this, you're making an effort to not have this reoccur. I think the easiest is if you do flow checks at least twice per month, and if for some odd reason you miss one, at least you've got, at least you've done one in a month. But if you do get an AQDA for a missed flow check, this is a critical criteria, so we have to issue an AQDA for this. It's not the end of the world. You just have to send us evidence of passing flow checks on the bracketing months. So if you failed April, send us evidence of the passing flow checks in March and May, and then you'll flag the data for that interim period. The March data will be flagged, and once we see that, once we agree upon that and see that that's been done in AQS, we can close out the AQDA. So it's a fairly easy one to resolve, but it's even easier to avoid altogether. That's the idea, is if we can avoid this particular AQDA, it'd be great to not have to issue AQDAs for missed flow checks. So part of the resolution should at least include a sentence or two and give some thought to how we prevent future recurrence of this, because we don't want to be coming back to the same place and having to issue that same AQDA. So that's what we're also looking for. Part of that resolution is a plan for ideally not having this happen in the future. This next scenario, this one's a little harder to, this can happen. Sometimes just the gaseous analyzer doesn't pass. For example, your ozone comes in too high or too low. And then we just have to look at, usually we look at data back to the last calibration, but we do have to keep in mind that the calibration, the analyzer can be fine. We are sampling the whole sample train, so there could be a leak in the sample train, there could be some scrubbing, and there could have also been drift, but there's, for example, with a lot of the Northern California fires, we did get some sample lines that got dirty and affected certain sites. Ideally, with resolving this, it sometimes gets a little harder. It's not totally clear cut. The more evidence you can provide, hopefully we can, if an invalidation is required, we hopefully can shorten that period. These ones get a little more involved, and it's a back and forth conversation. But you have to provide your initial resolution, and then we go from there. And like I said, the more supporting evidence, and this is why the common theme is documentation. The more stuff you've documented, the better. So in this third scenario, this is a situation where a BAM failed a flow check, and the district came back and they checked with 3 certified standards. And even though it was quite high, it wasn't as high as what we measured. And they had changed the pump, they had done a calibration, and then it did drift up, but it did not exceed, according to their 3 certified standards, did not exceed the 17.34. And going back, we checked, our delta cal had come back and an adjustment had been made. So this is a case where one of our instruments drifted, So the drift can happen to anybody. I mean, we're not absolutely perfect either. And in this case, they had chosen to apply a flag, and so they didn't need to be invalidated. They provided enough evidence with 3 certified flow standards, and given what the way that the fact that our delta cal needed an adjustment, it would have passed. So this, if you can provide plenty of evidence, sometimes we can release the data, or if you choose to flag it, because this did drift up. So they chose to flag it because there was a drift that had occurred, but it didn't exceed. So, like I said, the evidence, right? And any documentation, logbooks, excerpts, QC info, you know, documentation of when you last changed your lines. And then sometimes comparing to buddy sites, trend analysis, all these things can help out when you're trying to, ideally, if it comes to an invalidation, if you're trying to shorten that invalidation period, any of this can help. It's kind of like in college on a test, if you write nothing, you get 0. But if you at least write something, it can help. So this is kind of like you're going for partial credit at least sometimes. And sometimes you get full credit. If you provide enough good stuff, you can convince me that we need to release it and it's fine. But it's kind of, if you have nothing to show, then it's hard to you know, to justify. Okay, so as I've mentioned before, the 3 results from an AQDA is, you know, enough evidence is provided. We all agree, okay, this was, you know, we came out there as a one-time thing. You know, sometimes the data is released. We'll go back out there, revisit, and it passes in just an odd day. But sometimes, you know, data receives a qualifier flag, like the missed flow check. And sometimes we have to invalidate data. And in this, the good one, the null code I ask people to use is the AS, the poor quality assurance results null code, because it lets somebody going back, as Lena was saying, when you're kind of looking at an AMP 350 report 3-4 years later, you want to know why was this data invalidated. So AS is a great one to show, okay, there was an audit and something failed. The AN, if there's a machine malfunction, and we arrive, there is a specific AQDA I want to mention, the as-is AQDA. When we get somewhere and there's a non-functioning machine at the site, we still have to issue an AQDA that's called an as-is AQDA. That one I think is fine if it's an AN null code, machine malfunction, because that's really what was happening. It was malfunctioning or not functional at the time we got there. So why do we have to do this? When I was driving a family member to the Bay Area, to the airport, and coming back, I saw this big sign said, "Good morning, LA," and underneath it, it said, "What good is bad data?" So it was for some data management company, but it was. This is the whole idea. You know, we want quality, defensible data, and occasionally, as much as we all hate to see it done, we do have to invalidate. You know, back in the day, we were allowed to correct data, which. In some ways, there was some use to that, because there's some of this data that's being invalidated. If you could just bring it up 10% or 15%, it'd probably still be useful. But unfortunately, that's not allowed anymore. And I could see that could look bad to the public if there's a bunch of data being corrected. So the way it is now, we can't correct the data. So in some cases, we have to invalidate. And then the whole AQDA process, the documents the reasoning behind why we had to issue the AQDA, and you know, behind that invalidation period. So there's a bit of a history there that's documented. And ideally, the whole idea is to, you know, I'd love to see no AQDAs issued. It'd make my job a little easier, and I think nobody likes to deal with the paperwork of it. So. A lot of this stuff, if we can learn from these and not just take it as a mechanical thing, got to answer this, but like really think about, okay, what can we do? How can we improve the program in the future to avoid this type of AQDA recurring? And some will never reach quite 0, because certain things just drift and fail, and it's beyond our control. But I'd say more than half of the AQDAs issued could have been avoided. So I challenge everybody to try to avoid them, and I'll have less work, and I'll be happy. No, okay, thanks. Here's my contact info, and there's some resources for CANs and AQDAs. And like I said, I highly recommend Amon's going to Amon's breakout session. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Hey, thanks. This is more of a comment, but one of the ways that we in San Luis Obispo have found the CAN process to be useful is if we have data that we know we've through our own QA, QC activities have discovered might be questionable or might need invalidation. In the past, we just would have, done the invalidation and uploaded the data and have been done with it. But with the CAN process now, we've a couple times issued CANs on ourselves because it gives us an extra layer of documentation about the issue. And then, ARB has to approve it. So then we have ARB's stamp of approval so that if in the future some citizen group or an EPA TSA comes and says, hey, what went on here? We've got that extra documentation, and we can also say, well, ARB agreed with it, so it must be good.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the reasons this was created. It allows anybody, it's not just the auditors, but it allows anybody to use it as a process of documenting and ideally improving things. So, yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Yes, Mike?
So I'm going to touch upon this tomorrow, but one of the TSA findings this year in 2018 from EPA was how do we get people to embrace issuing cans in themselves? It's almost like a culture change. And I think it's because if you think about it, it's almost like people feel that issuing cans on themselves is pointing the finger at yourself, that I made a mistake. And we really, Hansa, when we asked Hansa to do this, it was friend or foe. I know it's hard to point your finger at yourself, but really think of this as a friendly process because we need to document these procedures, and EPA identified this as a lot of districts are not utilizing the CAN process. When a technician maybe finds a problem, doesn't want to report it to their manager because they made a mistake, and we want to get over that and not view it as a negative. And so I'll talk about it. It's really a change of culture to embrace that when you identify an issue, it's best to document it through the CAN process. So that has been a typical finding that we've had in ARBs, TSAs, as well as EPAs.
Thanks, Mike. All right, coffee time.